Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.7, the 25th of April. The 25th of April is a truly momentous day in the Second World War. Because on this day, the Soviets and Americans finally linked up along the Elbe River when the Soviet 5th Guards Army encountered patrols from the US 1st Army near Torgau, northeast of Leipzig. And as a result, the Third Reich was formally split in two. But to really add insult to injury, on the morning of the 25th, the fateful moment in the Battle of Berlin arrived, when the city was also formally encircled by the Red Army. When elements from Konev's 4th Guards Tank Army linked up with elements from Zhukov's 47th Army, near Ketzin, west of Potsdam. And just how did the Führer respond to these earth-shattering developments on the battlefield? Yes, you guessed it. Hitler responded with another round of hysterical outbursts, insisting that everything was dandy and that the fact Germany had just been bisected and the capital trapped by two Soviet fronts were just small setbacks which could be rectified by Wenck's counterattack to relieve Berlin. Hitler summoned General Weidling to the bunker, and when Weidling informed him that the Berlin garrison forces were being driven back across the city, Hitler simply insisted that things would change for the better, and that General Wenck's 12th Army, along with General Buss's 9th Army, would soon deliver a crushing blow to the Russians. Oh, and to top things off, Hitler also assured Weidling that Army Group Center, fresh from their victory in Bautzen, would also shortly be launching their own assault on the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin. If the madness of the situation couldn't get any madder, when the shocking news came through to the bunker that German forces to the north of Berlin, including Steiner's scratch force near Oranienburg, were now in full retreat following yet another Red Army assault, this time by Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front, the news was simply shrugged off as nothing more than a minor inconvenience, which could be solved by fresh German reinforcements. Accurately portraying just how removed from reality the Führer bunker was at this stage of the battle is no mean feat. But one observer described the atmosphere in the bunker as being that of a self-deception bordering on hypnosis, which hits the nail on the head pretty well, I think. The truth was, Berlin was surrounded, and the end was nigh. But still, the battle must go on. Just a quick interlude here to say that today's episode is quite battle-heavy, in the sense that it will focus mainly on the various Soviet advances happening across the city. So in order to keep up with the action, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder that in the description of this episode you'll find a link to the Google map I created, listing all of the important locations in and around Berlin which feature in the fighting. Okay, back to the episode. The Soviets started the day's operations in the city by launching Operation Salute, which was a huge aerial bombardment from the Red Army Air Force on hundreds of German targets throughout Berlin. This operation saw almost 1,400 aircraft carry out bombing raids on the city, and inevitably the air raids weakened the German defences even further, whilst causing chaos in the streets. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Red Army continued its assault on Spandau and the Gatow airfield, and these assaults were being spearheaded by the 125th Rifle Corps from the 47th Army. In Spandau, the progress was slow and bloody, but the Soviets were able to penetrate further into the district. However, in Gatow, even after launching another wave of attacks on the airfield, the Soviets were still unable to dislodge the German defenders. Meanwhile, to the east of Spandau, the area of Siemensstadt was also the scene of heavy fighting on the 25th of April, as the armoured lead elements of the 2nd Guards Tank Army continued their drive into the heavily industrialised district. And here, the factories and residential areas saw heavy fighting between the Russians and the German defenders. Such was the strength of the German resistance in the area, it would be many days before Siemensstadt was fully cleared of German troops. In the north of Berlin, the 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps crossed over the Hohenzollern Canal at dawn. Once across, they captured the Plötzensee prison and then proceeded to clear the northern bank of the Westhafen Canal. With the northern bank now clear, the Rifle Corps was ready to cross the Westhafen Canal itself. But they struggled to advance further as the Königsdamm Bridge, which represented the only feasible means across the canal leading into the district of Moabit, had been blown by the German defenders. The half-destroyed remains of the Königsdamm Bridge now presented a major obstacle for the Soviets, and the Germans had been extra inventive in delaying the enemy advance here, as they had even placed obstacles and mines onto the twisted wreckage of the half-collapsed bridge. The bridge had been so thoroughly wrecked and booby-trapped that only small groups of 5 Soviet soldiers could cross the bridge in one go. And even then, they had to try and remove the obstacles and defuse the mines whilst they were crossing. And if that wasn't enough, whilst the Soviet troops were crossing the bridge, they were of course being shot at continuously by German troops stationed on the southern side of the canal. And even if some Soviet soldiers made it across the bridge successfully, they then ran headfirst into the fortified German defensive positions around the Beuselstrasse S-Bahnhof. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets suffered greatly in their attempts to cross the bridge. The Soviets therefore decided to wait until nightfall before sending in their engineers to clear the mines and obstacles from the half-destroyed bridge. And the cover of darkness was also used to bring up extra machine guns and artillery pieces to the edge of the northern bank, which could then be used to assist the infantry in their attempts to cross the canal the next day. Whilst the 79th Corps prepared itself for a frontal assault on the Königsdamm Bridge, the 3rd Shock Army also dispatched the 12th Guards Rifle Corps on a flanking maneuver in order to find an alternative route into Moabit. This was successful as the 12th Guards Rifle Corps crossed the Fen Bridge further to the east at Nordhafen. And once across, they secured the bridge to prevent its recapture by German counterattacks. The 12th Guards Rifle Corps was now in the perfect position to push further into Moabit and flank the Beuselstrasse S-Bahnhof from the rear, but they were prevented from doing so by the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower, which started raining heavy artillery barrages down onto them. Their progress stalled, the 12th Guards Rifle Corps was instead forced to engage in deadly street fighting throughout the residential apartment blocks and factories north of Invalidenstrasse, where the local Volkssturm and Hitler Youth defenders had been strengthened by the 9th Fallschirmjäger Division. As the Soviet assault on the north and northwest of the city became bogged down, the Red Army's drive towards the east of the city centre continued, with the 3rd Shock Army's 7th Rifle Corps maintaining its steady drive towards Alexanderplatz. Unable to cope with the influx of enemy troops, the Berlin garrison forces struggled to check the Russian advance, until General Weidling committed reserve infantry units and some precious tanks from the Panzer Division Müncheberg to stabilize the line. Also in the east of the city, the 26th Guards Rifle Corps from the 5th Shock Army pressed their assault, but everywhere they turned, they were facing increasingly stiff German resistance. Moreover, just as with the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower to the north of the city, the Friedrichshain Flak Tower was also proving to be an impenetrable defensive position which the Soviets were unable to silence. As with Humboldt-Hain, the Soviets were forced to bypass the Friedrichshain flak tower, and they found that they were only able to advance through Friedrichshain itself under the protection of continuous Soviet artillery barrages, which blasted any German troops who stood in their way. Meanwhile, despite capturing the Schlesischer Bahnhof on the 23rd of April, the 5th Shock Army's 32nd Rifle Corps was still engaged in heavy fighting with German troops in the vicinity of the train station. And here, the extensive array of railway tracks around the station were turned into literal killing grounds, as every time Soviet infantry tried to advance along the train tracks, they were caught by bursts of German machine gun fire. Given the high losses they were suffering, it would take days for Russian infantry and armour to successfully clean out the area around the station. And in later years, Marshal Zhukov reflected on the fighting for the Schlesischer Bahnhof as some of the most intense and bloody of the assault on Berlin. So far in today's episode, we've covered the fighting in the north, the northwest, and the east of Berlin. But for the rest of the episode, I'll be looking at the fighting in the south of the city, as there are a number of key engagements here which will rage for the next few days. So in the southeast of the city, the 5th Shock Army's 9th Rifle Corps, who were fresh from their victory in Treptower Park the previous day, crossed the eastern section of the Landwehr Canal via Treptow into the district of Kreuzberg. And after crossing the canal, they immediately engaged in ferocious battles for control of the Görlitzer Bahnhof. In Neukölln, meanwhile, the 25th of April saw the arrival of SS Brigadeführer Krukenberg into the district, after he was made commander of Defence Sector C, which encompassed Neukölln. Krukenberg wasn't just made commander of Defence Sector C, however, because given his affinity with foreign SS volunteers, he was also given command of the Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, taking over from SS Brigadeführer Joachim Ziegler. Krukenberg arrived at Defence Sector C headquarters around midday, accompanied by his 350 French SS volunteers who were led by Henry Fenet, and when he inspected what remained of the Nordland Division, he was shocked by what he saw. The Nordland Division was comprised of 2 regiments, the Norge Regiment and the Denmark Regiment, and as the names suggest, this division was supposed to comprise mainly of SS volunteers from Norway and Denmark. But in reality, the majority of the soldiers in this division were either Germans from Germany or they were Volksdeutsche from Eastern Europe. In any case, the Nordland Division was a Waffen-SS division, so no one could doubt the motivation of the men fighting within it. As a testament to its fighting capabilities, the Nordland Division had been used in multiple counterattacks on the Soviet forces in Treptower Park the previous day. And as a result, Krukenberg was shaken to learn that the Norge and Denmark regiments could muster little more than a battalion between them, as they only had 600 and 700 men each. In any case, the Nordland Division remnants were battle-hardened and willing to fight to the last man. Krukenberg assessed the situation in the district, and the situation was pretty depressing. German forces beyond the inner defence ring were in full retreat, and the final German bridgehead south of the Teltow Canal, which ran through Britz in South Neukölln, was currently being ripped to pieces by Soviet tanks rampaging through their lines. Krukenberg could see that northern Neukölln was about to be subjected to a huge Soviet assault, so he prepared a well-defended fallback position around Hermannplatz, from which he could conduct a stubborn defence. He knew that any force seeking to break through to the centre of Berlin would have to pass through Hermannplatz, and he intended to make the Russians pay for every single metre. On the Hermannplatz, Krukenberg was able to observe the advancing Soviet tank armies from the towers on top of the large Karstadt department store. And to defend the perimeter of the Hermannplatz, Krukenberg deployed half of the French SS force, complemented by 100 Hitler Youth boys. This perimeter force was issued with Panzerfausts, and their job was to halt the legions of enemy tanks soon to be advancing along Hermannstrasse. In order to maximize the efficiency of their defense and to ration their meager ammunition supplies, the defense force had been instructed to wait until the last second before firing their Panzerfausts at the Soviet tanks, and they were also instructed to focus their fire on the turrets. The belief here was that by knocking out the turret, the tank would be disabled. The French SS fighters developed a reputation as pro-tank hunters throughout the remainder of the Battle of Berlin, and on the 25th of April alone, his force claimed 14 Soviet tanks in the fighting in Neukölln. These tank kills, as impressive as they were not going to save Berlin. But every enemy tank which was knocked out brought the beleaguered defenders of Berlin a moment of respite, at least until the next Soviet tank came trundling into view. However, as motivated and deadly as the tank-hunting Frenchmen were, the fact that they were being thrown into the front line in such a hodgepodge manner was further proof of how the defense of Berlin was becoming increasingly disjointed and desperate. And in a further ominous sign of things to come, despite the defences which Krukenberg had established at Hermannplatz, Central Command already warned him that his forces would likely be recalled into the centre of Berlin the next day, in order to stiffen the defence of the Zitadella district.
In spring 1945, the Red Army launched an overwhelming assault on Berlin, climaxing with the iconic raising of the red banner over the Reichstag. Listening to David Sumner describe these battles, it's amazing to think how the Wehrmacht was a fraction of the force that had attacked the Soviet Union only 5 years earlier, and then swept unstoppably across Ukraine and Russia. How did they get from the banks of the Volga thousands of miles farther west to the Elbe? Join me, Scott Burry, every 2 weeks as we follow the biggest war in human history on Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast to focus on the whole Eastern Front of World War II. I will tell you stories about the Second World War you've never heard before. Beyond Barbarossa is available on all podcasting platforms, and if you're listening to David, I know you can spell Barbarossa.
Elsewhere in Neukölln on the 25th, 1st Belarusian Front forces were also preparing to launch a massive assault on the Tempelhof Airport. Tempelhof Airport had by now become the most important command hub and supply depot for the German forces still holding on in the south of the city. Plus, the Russians had heard rumours that Luftwaffe planes stood ready in underground hangars waiting to fly the Nazi leadership out of the city if the Germans lost control of Berlin. And in recognition of just how vital the control of Tempelhof was, Marshal Zhukov ordered the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 8th Guards Army to attack and seize the airport. Sending in 2 entire armies to seize one airport wasn't just another example of Soviet overkill, however. No, the vast array of forces assembled for the assault were needed because Tempelhof Airport possessed significant defensive qualities. The airport was relatively small, with the building, the runways, and the land in between measuring roughly 3.5 square kilometers. But the complex of thick concrete hangars and buildings offered strong protection to the German defenders. Plus, the network of underground tunnels and cellars offered further opportunities for the Germans to form heavily defended redoubts which could tie down the Soviets in close quarters combat. The Germans were of course determined to hold Tempelhof at all costs, and they had positioned numerous units there for its defense. including a strong Luftwaffe flak unit, who now used their guns as effective anti-tank destroyers. Moreover, normal airport personnel had been thrown into the front line, and they were ordered to fight alongside the bulk of the Panzer Division Müncheberg, who had also occupied the airport. Whilst a Hitler Youth tank hunting unit, mounted on jeeps and equipped with Panzerfausts, also patrolled the airfield on the lookout for the approaching Soviet armour. As one last defensive measure, the southern and southeastern edge of the airfield, which ran along the S-Bahn line and thus formed part of the inner defence ring, had also been strengthened with a series of dug-in tanks. In the early morning hours of the 25th of April, the Soviets launched their assault on Tempelhof, with their absolute favourite thing in the world, a terrifying artillery barrage. This artillery barrage deliberately targeted the German troops and tanks who were positioned in between the runways. Lacking any cover, the German troops tried to shelter as best as they could in their foxholes and trenches. But men were blown apart, ammunition dumps exploded, and defensive lines were turned into dust. Once the barrage ended, the Soviets attacked by sending in wave after wave of infantry and tanks to smash through what remained of the forward German defences. By the afternoon, the Soviets had broken the outer defences of the airport, and they had successfully taken the runways. To capitalise on their success, in the early evening, the Soviets then threw another wave of tanks and infantry at the Germans, which pushed back the defending troops towards the airport's hangars. The Germans made a hasty retreat, seeking cover in the thick concrete buildings. But even this temporary safety was an illusion, because now the Germans were trapped in the buildings, and all they could do was wait for the inevitable charge of Russian infantry seeking to fight their way into the airport itself. To give you a flavour of the fighting at the Tempelhof Airport, I will share with you an excerpt from a diary which was kept by the aide-de-camp of the Panzer Division Müncheberg. This diary served as a record of his time during the Battle of Berlin, and I will quote from his diary throughout the series. Early morning. We are at Tempelhof Airport. Russian artillery is firing without respite. We need infantry reinforcements, but get motley emergency units instead. Behind the lines, civilians are still trying to get away right under the Russian artillery fire, dragging along some wretched bundle containing all they have left in the world. The Russians burn their way into buildings with flamethrowers, and the screams of the women and children are terrible. 1,500 hours. We have barely a dozen tanks and 30 armoured personnel carriers. These are all the armoured vehicles left. The chain of command seems all mixed up. We consistently get orders to send tanks to some danger spot or other, and they never come back. We have hardly any vehicles left to carry the wounded. Our artillery withdraws to new positions. We have very little ammunition left. The howling and explosions of the Russian Stalin organs, the screaming of the wounded, the roar of engines, and the rattle of machine guns, clouds of smoke, and the stench of burning, dead women in the streets, killed whilst trying to get water, but also, here and there, women with Panzerfausts, girls thirsting for revenge. Whilst the fighting raged for control of Tempelhof, the Soviets made two flanking attacks to the west and east of the airport. To the west, the 29th Guards Rifle Corps, supported by the 8th Mechanized Guards Corps, advanced into Schöneberg, whilst the 4th Guards Rifle Corps advanced to the east of Tempelhof deeper into Neukölln. Both flanking attacks were met with only light resistance from Volkssturm units, as the Nordland Panzergrenadier Division had pulled back to the Hermannplatz area in the north of Neukölln. And as a result of these flanking attacks, the German defenders, still holed up inside the Tempelhof Airport buildings, were in imminent danger of being cut off. Meanwhile, to the southwest of the city, Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front forces, led by the 3rd Guards Tank Army, continued their advance. Here, the extensive network of allotments and private gardens caused difficulties for the Soviet infantry, especially as the allotments prevented the movement of tanks, which deprived the infantry of armoured support. This was a new experience for the Red Army, and one which they hadn't trained for, and the absence of tank support meant that casualties were higher than expected. Despite the casualties, however, Konyev's forces managed to overrun all of the German defence positions in the area due to the sheer weight of numbers which they could bring to battle, and by the end of the day, the 3rd Guards Tank Army had penetrated deep into Steglitz, far beyond the inner defence ring. The 3rd Guards Tank Army pushed on, and the 6th Guards Tank Corps managed to obliterate a heavily armed but smaller flak tower at Königin-Luise-Platz at the northern edge of the Botanical Gardens in Steglitz. Once the flak tower had been silenced, the Soviet tanks were able to advance towards Schmargendorf in the district of Charlottenburg, which represented the western edge of the city centre. Meanwhile, other elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army advanced unopposed through the Dahlem area, before pushing through the western residential areas towards Nikolassee. The advance in these sectors was once again aided by the fact that the German defence was spotty at best, with some areas and defensive positions offering up stiff resistance, whilst in other areas the defenders melted away at the first sign of Soviet tanks. By now, it seems that the Berlin garrison had decided to concentrate its remaining forces in the centre of the city, and thus the Germans were content to abandon huge swathes of Berlin to the incoming Red Army. Nevertheless, this armoured thrust through the southwest of Berlin towards the central district of Charlottenburg shows that Konyev was still determined to have his forces play a significant role in the fighting for the centre of Berlin, meaning the race for the Reichstag between Marshal Konyev and Marshal Zhukov was still very much on. That said, whilst the Soviets continued their advance into the centre of Berlin on the 25th, Marshal Konyev's 4th Guards Tank Army, thrusting towards the towns of Potsdam and Brandenburg to the west of Berlin, was being subjected to continuous flanking attacks from General Wenck's newly arrived 12th Army. But no one was more interested in the movements of the 12th Army than Adolf Hitler himself, of course. So shortly before midnight, Hitler demanded an update from Jodl regarding Wenck's 12th Army and its mission to link up with General Buss's 9th Army in the planned counterattack to relieve Berlin. Jodl wanted to keep Hitler happy, so he rather cryptically replied that relief efforts had already begun. Don't go into too much detail there, Jodl. Hitler was delighted, and he went to bed in a better mood, optimistic that perhaps Berlin would be saved, after all.